how to use relative clauses. They can be tricky, but they're really useful. I explain everything in this video. Hello, I'm Shona and I run the website Perfect English Grammar. We help millions of students every month improve their grammar and their English. We can use relative clauses to join two sentences to sound more advanced and natural. We can also use relative clauses to add more information about a noun. A relative clause is a type of subordinate clause. Here are two sentences. I met a woman. The woman was a doctor. This sounds very simple. It's correct, but it's not so advanced. I met a woman who was a doctor. This is one sentence and it sounds much better. The main clause is I met a woman and the relative clause is who was a doctor. Here's another example. She bought the house. The house was near to the park. Two sentences, very simple. She bought the house which was near to the park. One sentence and it sounds more advanced and more natural. The main clause is she bought the house and the relative clause is which was near to the park. We need to use a relative pronoun in a relative clause. Relative pronouns are words like who, which or that. We use which or that for things and who or that for people. We can use a relative clause after the subject or the object of the main clause. The relative clause stays next to its noun. He ate an apple which came from the garden. The relative clause adds extra information about the word apple. Apple is the object of the main clause. The boy who is in the car likes ice cream. The relative clause, who is in the car, describes the boy, and the boy is the subject of the main clause. You can see in this case, the relative clause is kind of in the middle of the sentence. There are two types of relative clause, defining and non-defining. We need the information in a defining relative clause to understand which noun we are talking about. So the relative clause is necessary to understand the sentence. I like the woman who lives next door. If I don't say who lives next door, then you don't know who I mean. We can use who or which or that with defining relative clauses, and they don't need commas. The boy that I saw yesterday is called William. The books that are on the table belong to James. She ate all the food that you brought. I bought the phone that was in the shop. If I don't add that was in the shop, you don't know which phone I'm talking about. On the other hand, a non-defining relative clause gives us extra information about something. We don't need this information to understand the sentence. I live in London, which has some fantastic parks. I think the person I'm talking to understands what I mean when I say London, which city I mean. So, which has some fantastic parks is just extra information. It's very true as well, to be clear. The parks in London are great. We can't use that with non-defining relative clauses. Instead, we need to use which if the pronoun is talking about a thing and who if we are talking about a person. We need to use a comma or maybe two commas with non-defining relative clauses. My boss, comma, who is very nice, comma, lives in Manchester. My bicycle, comma, which I've had for more than 10 years, comma, is falling apart. Yesterday, I called our friend Julie, comma, who lives in New York. I really love the new Chinese restaurant, comma, which we went to last night. When we're talking about relative clauses, it's really important to understand where the subject is and where the object is, both in the relative clause and in the main clause of the sentence. I saw the cat that ate the birthday cake. In this case, the subject of the main clause is I, and the object of the main clause is the cat. On the other hand, the subject of the relative clause is that, which means the cat. And the object is the birthday cake, because the cat is the one who did the verb, who ate the cake. Here's another example. He is the man that lives in my street. Here, the relative clause is that lives in my street. The relative pronoun is that. That is the subject of the relative clause, because that is the subject of the verb lives. And this one is a defining relative clause because we need the extra information in the relative clause to understand which man we are talking about. I saw the cat that Julie stroked. In this case, again, the subject of the main clause is I, and the object of the main clause is the cat. But the subject of the relative clause is Julie, and that, which means the cat, is the object. Because Julie stroked the cat, Julie did the verb. Here's another example. He is the man that my sister knows. Here the relative clause is that my sister knows. The relative pronoun is that, and that is the object of the relative clause because it's the object of the verb knows. The subject of the relative clause is my sister. She is the one who knows somebody. Okay, another example. Is this cool? Is it clear? There's the coffee that was on the table. The relative clause is that was on the table. That is the subject of the relative clause. There's the coffee that Julie brought. In this case, the relative clause is that Julie brought. That is the object of the relative clause because that, the coffee, is the object of brought. The subject of brought is Julie. Here's a last example. I met the girl that knew my mother. The relative clause is that knew my mother. That is the subject of the relative clause because the girl is the person who did the knowing. My mother is the object. I met the girl that David knew, on the other hand. The relative clause is that David knew. That is the object of the relative clause because David is the subject of the verb knew. I hope that makes sense. There are a few reasons why we need to know if the relative pronoun is the subject or the object of the relative clause. The first reason is that sometimes we can drop the relative pronoun. But we can only do this when the relative pronoun is the object of the relative clause. She drank the coffee that was on the table. Here, that is the subject of the relative clause, so we can't drop it. She drank the coffee that James brought. Here, that is the object of the relative clause. The subject is James, so we can choose to drop that if we want. The meaning is exactly the same with or without that. The second reason why we need to know if the relative pronoun is the subject or the object of the relative clause is the word whom. We can choose to use whom instead of who when it's the object of the relative clause. She is the girl whom I saw. In this case, the relative pronoun whom is the object of the relative clause. I am the subject, and the verb is saw. She is the girl who saw me. In this case, who is the subject of the relative clause. Me is the object. You can also use who instead of whom in modern UK English. This is because nowadays, certainly in the UK, whom is quite old-fashioned, and mostly we just use who, whether it's the subject or the object. However, in very traditional grammar, and also in the United States, it's more common to use whom. It's very good to know when you should or shouldn't use it in theory, and then you can choose if you would like to be traditionally correct or kind of more normal and standard. Let's talk about the word whose. Whose is always the subject of the relative clause and it can't be left out. It replaces a possessive. It can be used for people and things. The dog is over there. The dog's owner lives next door. The dog whose owner lives next door is over there. The little girl is sad. The little girl's doll was lost. The little girl whose doll was lost is sad. The woman is coming tonight. Her car is a BMW. The woman whose car is a BMW is coming tonight. Now let's talk about prepositions. If the verb in the relative clause needs a preposition, we usually put it with its verb. For example, the verb listen needs the preposition to. The music is good. Julie listens to the music. The music which Julie listens to is good. You see the to is there after listens. It's not next to music. Let's take work with. My brother met a woman. I used to work with the woman. My brother met a woman who I used to work with. If we are being very, very formal, we can put the preposition before whom or which. We don't use that in this case. This is extremely traditional grammar, and I don't recommend you say this in normal life. There's the boy to whom I talked. Normally we'd say, there's the boy who I talked to. We met the doctor with whom James used to work. Normally we'd say, we met the doctor who James used to work with. I loved the music to which she was listening. When we are using a phrasal verb, the preposition does not move. It needs to stay with its verb. I ate all the food that Lucy picked up. We can't say, I ate all the food up which Lucy picked. That's not possible. If we are talking about something that happens in a place and we use a relative clause, we have two possibilities. We can choose to use where instead of a different relative pronoun, or we can use that and a preposition. Often the preposition is in, but not always. It depends on the type of place. So, let's take two sentences. I went to the town. I was born in the town. Our two options are, I went to the town where I was born. Or we can say, I went to the town that I was born in. Here's another example. We went to the restaurant and she met her husband in the restaurant. We went to the restaurant where she met her husband. Or we went to the restaurant that she met her husband in. On the other hand, if we're saying something about the place itself rather than something that happened there, we use that in the normal way. I went to a town that has a long name. So this is, the name is talking about the town. Like I'm talking about the town. I'm not talking about something that happened in the town. So we can't say in this case, I went to a town where has a long name. That's not possible. We can also sometimes use when or why instead of relative pronouns and prepositions. Let's take an example. The summer was long and hot. I graduated from university in the summer. So we can say either, the summer when I graduated was long and hot. Or we can say, the summer that I graduated in was long and hot. Or very formally, we can say, the summer in which I graduated was long and hot. We can use a non-defining relative clause with a number or a quantifier with of and which or whom. The boys had a lot of toys, some of which were broken. We saw all the students, a few of whom had failed the exam. Again, because there is whom, it sounds quite formal. He dropped the glasses, all of which broke. I met the girls, one of whom I knew already. They picked up a pile of books, two of which were new. We can use participle clauses to shorten sentences that have longer relative clauses. So this is quite an advanced use. In this case, we drop the relative pronoun, that, who, or which, and any auxiliary verbs, and we leave a participle clause. We often do this with past participles. I ate the sandwich that was left at the end. If we reduce it, we say, I ate the sandwich left at the end. So I've dropped that and was. She took the pen, which was balanced on the chair. This changes to, she took the pen, balanced on the chair. These types of clauses often replace a simple passive relative clause. With present participles, I spoke to the girl who was sitting next to me. We say instead, I spoke to the girl sitting next to me. He's looking at the dog, which is playing in the park. He's looking at the dog playing in the park. This type of clause can replace any active verb relative clause, often a continuous tense verb. And finally, we can do this with passive participles. The film, which is being shown tonight, won an Oscar. Instead, we can say, the film being shown tonight won an Oscar. The man who is being interviewed right now is a famous actor. The man being interviewed right now is a famous actor. Thank you so much for watching. Please do look in the description to find a link to some exercises, and please do subscribe to the channel.